Hi, welcome to the ZP Developer Zone. So we like to do this Developer Zone once a week, and it's really just answering technical questions that have come in during the week. So it does say the 2nd of February, but you've probably heard me say that we sometimes go early because when it's a sort of quiet, say around, then we just go and do the webinar. So it is actually the 1st of February 2025, but that said, we will go live now. Now, I've subtitled this Enzyme Sensors because I realize that everything I'm going to talk about this evening is actually enzyme sensors. I'm going to talk about creatinine, I'm going to talk about hormones, estradiol and progesterone, and I'm also going to talk about mediated electrodes. And often you can use mediated electrodes when you're dealing with enzyme systems called dehydrogenases, or mediated electrodes when you're dealing with oxidases. So these are, I don't want to say random questions, but they've come in for 3 different locations. They're all around the same topic. So question 1, 2, and 3 will all be kind of related this evening. I must remember to put links to any of the technologies that I talk about this evening. So I will be talking about hypervalue carbon electrodes, which are pretty good for enzyme work. I'll be talking about our 501 carbon electrodes, which are also pretty good. And they've got this kind of circular electrode on these guys. So this makes them quite easy to drop cast onto and functionalize. I'll be talking about the Sensi-All potentiostat, which there's also an app to drive this potentiostat as well. It's not a theme this evening, but this is really good for making a minimally viable product with. So if somebody's thinking about making a sort of blood test, a hormonal blood test, for example, this will be a really good platform on which to actually do that, because then you can give somebody an MVP in fairly short order, as opposed to kind of, building apps, building hardware, building the assay. The real value add actually in doing enzyme biosensor work, it ain't the electronics, it ain't the app, it's certainly not the screen printed electrode, it's the actual assay itself. That's the real value add. With that said, I must remember to link to these technologies as we go forward, and I'll put a 10% discount code here as well, which I realize is just actually expired, so I might have to change that to February. With that said, question number 1, I'll be talking about doing creatinine sensors. This will probably involve 3 enzymes, and that's not unusual. And I seem to remember the cholesterol sensor often takes at least a couple of enzymes as well. So I'll talk about creatinine sensors this evening. I'll talk about estradiol and progesterone. I think estradiol, at least if memory serves me right, there's more precedence for doing estradiol than it is for doing progesterone, but I will talk about this evening. And in fact, I realize that question number 3, I won't be bringing it up, but in question number 3, they have shared some slides with me where they actually are detecting in blood. Oh, and that's not something I'm going to do this evening, but if anyone's trying to make a assay for blood, absolutely electrochemistry is one of the best assays for doing point of care diagnostics in blood. Somebody said to me the other day that the term point of care diagnostics had kind of sort of was a, I don't want to say a bad word among investors, but I really was a bit surprised by that, because I think point of care diagnostics is really a thing. And along with point of care, we've got point of need. And, the world essentially doesn't need centralized laboratories. It's better that we make measurements next to the patient, or in the doctor's office, or next to the production line. This is where analysis is needed. If we have to centralize test every time, it's really not efficient. There's all sorts of, I think there's all sorts of problems with centralizing test. With that said, let's go forward and talk about creatinine. If you want to make a creatinine sensor, this is the target itself. Creatinine, it's a biomarker for several disease states, including kidney function. Creatine, sorry. So if we're going to try and make a creatinine sensor, then we need a series of enzymes. Creatininase, I can just about pronounce that correctly. So it takes the creatinine to creatine. You can tell that I don't take these muscle supplements, because there's lots of people who take creatine for muscle gain. But anyway, I can just about say creatine. We have creatinase, which converts it to something called sarcosine. So this is essentially an enzyme cascade, and it's not unusual in the world of electrochemical biosensing to have several enzymes that kind of end up transforming the original substrate that we're trying to detect down to something that we can detect. And in fact, often our friend in electrochemistry, especially when there's an oxidase enzyme involved, is hydroperoxide. I will probably at some point in the next 20 minutes talk about you can detect hydroperoxides using platinum electrodes, which I must remember to link. We have a platinum electrode in this form factor, and we also have a carbon electrode in this form factor as well. And people are welcome to try them both out for this kind of work. But if you're going to do the hydroperoxide directly, then you're probably better off using platinum. So we've got this enzyme cascade, which goes really from creatinine to hydrogen peroxide. And at ZP, we're used to doing both kind of transdermal type sensors in this form factor. Now, I do not believe I've got this on the website because it's kind of otherwise it encourages people to buy them and start doing this kind of work. And if you're gonna start sticking sensors in through within people, ZP has to be deeply involved. Otherwise, people can end up causing harm to themselves, or more importantly, to patients or volunteers. But we can kind of prove out these kind of sensors using, and this is the 501 platinum electrode there. We can start functionalizing these electrodes with the kind of required enzymes, probably in a layered format like this. I kind of like this. I like this science, the way we can spatially resolve these by just drop casting one upon the other and actually building up that kind of sensor. As I say, you can actually, even though this cascade finishes with hydrogen peroxide, you could actually introduce a catalytic layer here, or call it a mediator. But if you're just trying to do, just FYI, if you're trying to do continuous monitoring or something, then all these materials have to be fixed in place on the sensor. But if you're just wanting to make a blood test, they didn't actually have to be fixed in place. They could actually be quite soluble and actually get into the sample. So glucose sensors for doing blood glucose readings, self-monitoring blood glucose, those enzymes are not fixed in place. They're actually able to solubilize and dissolve into the sample. But that said, I think there's enough literature precedence to kind of say that you really should be able to make a creatinine sensor quite readily. And the ZP, screen printed electrodes, either the platinum if you want to just directly detect hydrogen peroxide, or the carbon if you want to kind of go via a mediator. And you should be able to, like I say, these 501 designs allow you to kind of be able to dry pipette, and then create the sensor. I'm just going to do a quick experiment actually, and I've labeled it amperometry because it reminds me what I'm actually meant to be doing. So I will go to the potentiostat. I've scanned the QR code, so I've actually gone into amperometry mode. I'm going to put some. Well, first of all, I'm just going to label this up. So this is a very cool type of potentiostat because I actually think this is really 2025 kind of technology. That it's a potentiostat in Bluetooth connection with my phone. In a bit, you'll see that I'll program it using QR codes. I'm just giving this a name. I'm trying to think and do it at the same time, so I'm not very good at that. But you'll also see that it's connected to the cloud as well. So, imagine that we developed a new type of sensor, so we've functionalized this electrode in some meaningful manner. I'm going to do a kind of experiment that we may do in our lab this evening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on essentially a blank solution. Let me just do that. That's one of the powers of electrochemistry, especially when you do it on a screen printed electrode like this. I only need 50 microliters, which can be really valuable actually, because sometimes materials can be quite expensive actually. So I've got my settings. I've got my runtime at 90 seconds. I've got my save rate rather at 1 point per second. My apply voltage is minus 300 millivolts. It's a bit unusual. I'm doing this in a kind of reductive mode. I know sometimes people are often more used to seeing this kind of data in an oxidative mode, but my solution is ferricyanide. So the Ferri means it's Fe3+, and so I can reduce it to Fe2+. I've got my current range here. So what I'll do now is I've got just a blank buffer on there, no real redox active molecule in there. I'm just going to gather up some redox active molecule, because I said ferricyanide, but there's actually no ferricyanide on there yet. I'm putting some ferricyanide just into a pipette tip now. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit start, and the assay should start. So this is running along now. I'll just let it kind of go for a bit, and then I'll drop in some ferricyanide into that. So the current suddenly went very sort of in the negative current range, because I'm reducing ferricyanide to ferrocyanide. I'll put in a bit more. If we were making an enzyme sensor and we wanted to kind of show that that enzyme sensor was reacting proportionally to the analyte, this would be the kind of experiment that we could do to prove that out. You'll see me show you, we also do this kind of work sometimes in stirred reactors as well, which makes it a bit simpler to kind of interpret the data. But let me just put a bit more in here. But you can see, you know, in fact, if anything, I can see that that peak is actually going up as I add in more of this material. I'm not necessarily doing this in the most controlled experimental manner ever, but I like this potentiostat. It looks like a product. What's wrong with, let me just put in the last drop. What really annoys me is the instruments that look like lab instruments, and so people can't imagine those instruments ever getting out of the lab. But we actually use this in real products. So now what it's doing now is it's actually analyzing the data and actually sending that data to the cloud. So it's a really 2025 kind of technology that we can set it up very quickly. So there was no cabling involved. I just clicked it shut. That made connection with the screen printed electrodes. Just out of interest as well, we've done a really good job. A lot of these USB-C power potentiostats, people never talk about it, but actually they really suffer from compliance voltage. I have done videos about compliance voltage, but this particular, some of my competitors mentioned, they've told me they like this particular screen printed electrode. This is the hypervalue carbon electrode. The reason I like it is because it's got a really low compliance voltage. Anyway, that said, I've got my data and it just says upload complete. I'm just gonna share my screen with you for a second. So let me just go to screen here. So this is something that it's a cloud system that comes with the instrument. I'm just going to do a quick reload. Oh, I did a reload. I should have done a refresh, but no big deal. But all the data gets saved up to the cloud, so I can see the ferry cyanide experiment that I just did, and I can see here my this is my buffer. Then I added in the first drop. I get a kind of current, then I add in the second drop, and then I add in the third drop, and then I add in the fourth drop. And I can actually see those sort of new currents are all, you know, the magnitude of them is increasing as I essentially add in more ferricyanide to that particular experiment. So that's a kind of classical way, that's the kind of experiment that we may do to actually show that an enzyme system was actually working. So bear with me, because I've got another question now about hormones. So I really like hormones. I feel like the world is, you know, one of the biggest gaps left in the world of electrochemical biosensing and sensing in general is actually hormones. So I think it's a really good thing to work on. The market's not so full, so estradiol and progesterone. We've got experience with androstenone, and I bring up a molecule here, or I mentioned something here called dehydrogenases. And I do mention here a cofactor for dehydrogenases called NAD+. Now, the reason I mention that is because we do have experience with androstenone. So we definitely have hormone experience at ZP. And we are really, really experienced on dehydrogenase enzymes. So these things are all kind of weighing that, at least internally at ZP, we have experience, let's say, in this particular area. Including doing continuous monitoring of things like, and now this is a ketone, which is a small molecule, but we've done continuous monitoring of ketones using NAD+. The reason I bring it up a little bit is because dehydrogenases, they have a cofactor called NAD+. It makes it quite hard to do continuous monitoring because the NAD+ quite likes to escape. It's quite a soluble, mobile material. So you're trying to make this continuous measurement in a sensor, and the cofactor just diffuses away. And I was telling somebody the other day, oh yeah, we got our sensor to work for 12 days. They were like, 12 days? They were saying, that the only other people who managed to get a dehydrogenase sensor to run quite so long are Abbott. Well, of course, the difference between Abbott and us is about $55 billion per annum. But that said, I've got quite high confidence in estradiol, and with progesterone, it looks a little bit trickier. I couldn't find quite so much literature around progesterone, so I can't, we've got a lot of experience in androstenone and dehydrogenases in general, including continuous monitoring. Estradiol, there's a lot of literature precedence out there, and with progesterone, I haven't quite identified the enzyme for that. But that said, we do have a couple of technology sets for this kind of thing. We have what I call a point of care diagnostic technology set, which is really this Sense It All platform that I have in front of me here. So here it is. And we also have a wearable platform as well. But the wearable platform we're only releasing into well-funded client projects at the moment, because we'll probably do that for just the next couple of years. But if people are well-funded and they want to bring ZP in as a true partner, a true paid-for partner, then we're super happy to release it that way. But keep an eye on us anyway, because we may release it onto the market. We can do these kind of sensors in a couple of form factors. Even if you're ultimately trying to make something that's possibly transdermal, it's probably worth working on planar screen printed electrodes, just because it's quick and easier to do than to try and make up all these kind of 3D electrodes. But looking at this, I mean, to build up a sensor for these hormones, you probably need a catalytic layer, or call it a mediated layer. You will need the enzyme layer, and you'll probably need what I call a barrier layer to encapsulate all that. And the barrier layer has to be quite intelligent, because it has to stop that NAD plus escaping. But ZP actually does have a lot of experience on that. To make these kind of hormone sensors, then I've imagined here probably estradiol, which is in its reduced state. You've got the dehydrogenase enzyme, which will react with its cofactor and end up oxidizing the reduced hormone to its oxidized format. And then you can have a mediator in there to essentially take the proton and the electron from NADH and convert that back to NAD plus, and then you essentially get an electron transferring. And you can read that by amperometry. And I did an amperometry experiment earlier on. So that amperometry experiment I was doing earlier on is kind of relevant to people who are doing oxidases and dehydrogenases. It's just quite a nice way of showing, does this sensor make sense, and am I able to show a signal versus concentration? So I say here I'm going to do an amperometry experiment, but I'm actually going to do a quick cyclovoltammetry experiment, in fact. So let me just change cameras for a second, and let me get that solution off that electrode. I'll just take that off just real quick, which I've done. I'm going to just put on this ferricyanide solution, 5 millimolar ferricyanide, 50 microliters. I'm just going to go to cyclic voltammetry mode, which I will do by going done. I'm just looking here and just trying to figure out cyclic voltammetry mode, because I scanned the QR code. I'm just going to call this ferricyclic so I can find it. Cyclic. Yeah. I go backwards. I'll go continue. Right. So I probably want to start at, I don't know, minus 300. Yeah, I couldn't see my screen because my own thumb was in the way. I'll go to 600 millivolts. Sure, I'll scan quite fast. You'll often see me scan quite fast. If you're doing development of an assay and it's for real world application, scan fast. I'm sorry, but patients don't want to wait around for your 3-minute assay whilst you kind of go, you trundle at 10 millivolts per second. I'll just put the current range up. I may make some mistakes. I'm doing this fairly spontaneously, but that said, off it goes. So we're just doing a quick CV now. I get this kind of real-time feedback on the app. I can just probably see the oxidation peak there because I started off in a negative potential. That meant that the ferricyanide became ferrocyanide. Then I oxidized it back to ferricyanide. Now we're reducing it to ferricyanide to ferrocyanide, and that should run. It says upload complete. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen again, which I will go here. So that was that amperometry experiment. Let's go back to reports. Let's just do a quick refresh here. And there's the cyclovoltammetry experiment, which is jumping up here. Oh, I got a little bit of noise there, but I'll just, it's quite nice actually. Wish I hadn't quite got that little bit of noise, but that said, let me just grab it like that. Really quite a nice CV actually, considering that's quite nice actually. So I did that quite, I must have just tapped the solution slightly, but that said, there's my cyclovoltammetry of ferricyanide. So earlier on, the reason I wanted to do this is because earlier on I did a sort of an amperometry experiment. I did minus 300 millivolts. And the reason I did it minus 300 millivolts, I realize now I should have actually done it. I could have done it at probably plus 100 millivolts, because minus 300 millivolts is, well, let's say negative of the reduction potential anyway. So I didn't need to quite do minus 300 millivolts. But anyway, it gave me a nice signal. But that's not really the point. The point is you should probably use the potential that you need rather than the potential that just gives you the best signal. Getting the best signal is important, but of course you can sometimes start reducing other molecules that otherwise you wouldn't have reduced. Anyway, I'm not going to overplay that or emphasize that point, but I should call that a demo of cyclovoltammetry. It's probably worth saying that if you are a startup, you can engage ZP directly, and you can just engage us in consultancy services, and I've put a link to that below. Now, question number 3, this is question number 1 and question number 2 are more kind of commercial, and number 3 is more actually about, at ZP, we do support academics, especially if they're using our electrodes, which actually these guys are. They're working on something I call an EC mechanism. They've got an electrochemistry step, and they've got then a chemistry step. And what they're doing here a little bit is they've got some cyclovoltammetry going on. They've made themselves a mediated electrode. So I was sort of mentioning earlier on, you can take a carbon electrode and you can put a mediator down, which they have done. And they're adding in some hydrogen peroxide. And I'm going to talk to them this week. And I suspect that they're worried that their CV is not really significantly changing with the hydrogen peroxide. They've definitely made a redox active electrode. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's got these, and you can also tell actually by the shape of this that this is not a solution phase piece of electrochemistry. The symmetry of this means that this is stationary on the electrode. But I know what they're going to be saying. They're going to be saying, well, why can we not really see the effect of hydrogen peroxide too much? And what it is they're going from the reduction state, which is kind of at minus 200 millivolts, up to the oxidation, which is probably taking place at about 0.1 or 100 millivolts. But they actually scan up to 500 millivolts, and then they go back again. But they're scanning at 100 millivolts per second. So that entire experiment is over in 14 seconds. So they're expecting to see the effect of hydrogen peroxide, and they're not really seeing it. But what's happening is they're going from reduction to oxidized, and oxidized back to reduced so quickly that the slightly slower chemistry step, which would be the interaction of hydrogen peroxide with this surface, is not really taking place. They're seeing the intrinsic redox chemistry of the catalytic material that they put on the surface, but they're not seeing its reaction with the chemistry. But in fact, if they scan slower, so I'm sort of suggesting here, I don't like scanning slow, I don't, but if you want to kind of tease out a mechanism, and academia is interested in mechanisms, if they scan slower, and rather than doing 100 millivolts per second, did 10 millivolts per second, so they would kind of, same experiment, but just go slower up and slower down. It just takes 10 times as long, but then they would get a smaller CV because the peak heights of cyclovoltammetry are not defined by, but can be characterized by an equation called the Randall-Savich equation, which kind of says that peak height is proportional to the square root of scan rate. So they'll get smaller peaks, but then when they add the hydrogen peroxide in, they're adding a sort of chemical oxidizer in, it will change the shape of the CV. So I'll give them some advice this week, which just says, if you want to tease out this EC mechanism, you have to slow up the scan rate in order to give the C part of your chemical mechanism. You have to slow the scan rate so that actually you do have time to see that chemical reaction. if anyone's FYI, I'm quite interested in Python these days and actually modeling these kind of systems in Python. So if that becomes interesting, give me a shout and I'll probably make some videos about it, because we just live in an amazing world now actually where you can, I can talk about this in a kind of qualitative manner, but it's not that hard to quantify this kind of stuff these days in a bit of Python code as well. They're also a little bit concerned that they keep on scanning this thing and it's changing a lot. Don't be worried, honestly, because cyclovoltammetry is a good method for functionalizing materials onto electrodes. It's a good system for characterizing electrodes, but it's not the way these people are intending to run this electrode. They're actually intending to run it by amperometry. So the fact that this electrode may change as you do cycles, it's funny how many people get obsessed with that. But I would say, is that the way you're intending to run the electrode? No, I'm intending to run it by amperometry. So don't get too obsessed by what you see by cyclovoltammetry. Cyclovoltammetry is useful, but one of the ways I could just say this is, so they're going from, when they're doing cyclovoltammetry, they go from minus 200 millivolts to 500 millivolts. Energy, and I think it's Gibbs free energy, is proportional to potential. So they're basically putting in a lot of energy into the system. When they run this, they're probably more likely to be just holding it at 0 volts. So they're not holding it in these extreme energy conditions like, half a volt. There's quite a lot of energy in half a volt, actually. So don't dismiss your electrode or your materials because of some cyclovoltammetry experiments. Dismiss it if the amperometry is not working. And that's stuff you can't get in the textbook. That's just experience, to be honest with you. So I'm going to tell them not to worry about that too much. I mean, it looks a bit dramatic that they go from that to that, but then again, they're cycling quite fast. They're going up to quite high energies. They're never intending to go to half a volt. So be careful of that. I don't think I have an awful lot more to say on this, but I will talk to them this week. As it is, they get a signal versus concentration. So if you get a signal versus concentration, that's what you're interested in. Whether your cyclovoltammetry matches up that much. Just FYI, I sort of half did this evening as well, but when we are trying to characterize whether a sensor is working or not, we don't dismiss it by cyclovoltammetry necessarily. We'll set up like a beaker like this, have our sensor in there. We'll have it sitting in no analyte, then we'll pipette in some analyte, see if the signal increases, pipette in some more analyte, see if the signal increases, pipette in some more analyte, see if the signal increases. This is the kind of way we would confirm whether we thought something was working or not. Not the world's greatest data, but when I say, this is what we would do, this is what we do all of the time. I mean, at ZP, I think we're by far one of the, I don't want to say busiest, but we really do a lot of electrochemistry and, at ZP. So when we talk, we're talking with experience. The nice thing is they're doing some nice work, and they're doing all of this really nice work on our hypervalue carbon electrode. So thank you very much to them. So question number 1, creatinine sensors. Super easy, at least to get to a TRL3, technology readiness level number 3, proof of principle, really no issue. Estradiol and progesterone in blood. Estradiol, I think, is, at least there's more literature precedence for it, but that one I would sort of consider low hanging fruit. And then there's mediated electrodes. Funny, I'm talking about mediated electrons for the other 2, and then I'm supporting somebody else on question number 3. So when we talk at ZP, it's because we generally are doing this stuff. Now, if you have any questions, technical questions, product questions, then don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.